Alright, time to stop being a bitch. Let's get back to it. I don't have. Alright, yeah, I do. Case. Just listening to music for a sec, but that's just not the strat. Okay. I want to learn cool shit so I can actually make some things. Like right now, the best thing I could do is maybe a deterministic ish. Well, it's not like a set of enemies. Oh, God, classes would be so much better. Like I could have namespaces with values and functions, and it's kind of like an object. So I could have a namespace and just call it enemy, and then have enemy attack, and the attack would be the enemy attacking the player, and it calls a Mersenne twister to get a random number to see which attack it does, or something like that. Or maybe you call enemy decision, and then it gets a random number, and depending on the random number, via a pseudo-random number generator, it does some sort of different, some random behavior. Maybe it waits, and maybe it plays like, or it executes one of a bunch of different little options, like in Pokemon. Like sometimes the enemy's just watching the, like sometimes the Pokemon just watches the player. It's like, oh, is watching closely or something like that. So it could be that, and then it could attack, and then the damage could be random as well. So another call to the same Mersenne twister, just for a different range with a standard, a uniform distribution. I said standard because it's in the standard names, or the standard, standard library or standard namespace. So I could do something like that. Oh, that's why objects are cool. Because of instantiation. Because how do I know? Well, not how do I know, I guess, but if I wanted to keep track of 8 different enemies, I would need to have a separate number for each enemy's health and each whatever. So like I could do, and I'd have to code in separate syntax, or separate I'd have to hard code enemy 7 does this, and then enemy 8 does this, and then enemy 9 or whatever. But I think if I had objects, one, I could have all those functions in an object, so member functions, and enemy 1 just does its attack. And when I create an enemy, it checks how many enemies there are, and if there are 3, then it makes it number 4, and if there are 5, then it makes it number 6. And each one has it, and in each one's attack, it just prints the current attack of that one. So I think I'd still need hard-coded stuff for the attacks, though. I'd have to call, like, I instantiate 5 enemies, and then I say, hey, the first one goes, and then the second one goes. Or maybe I could have a round system. So we say round 1. In each round, all the enemies go, and the enemies have a health, or they have a Boolean that tracks if they're dead or not. And all the enemies that aren't dead attack or do something, some behavior, and then the player goes. So it's like enemy turn, player turn, enemy turn, player turn. And then we have a do while loop, and we do it until, or while the player and the enemies are alive. Therefore, if all the enemies are dead, we continue on. But if the player dies, we continue on. And we could stop it short if the player dies, and then you have to reset or something. And then you go to the next thing. So you'd have different encounters. And then you could have those encounters be in their own functions. So you initiate encounter A, or encounter F3, and it's the forest encounter with 3 enemies. And you have some scripted shit that happens in there. You have the strings play out for the logic and what's happening. And then you have the actual fight happen, where it's a do while, where the enemies go first and then the player goes, then whatever. Or just a while true. While true probably makes sense. Or while player is alive. Or while player and enemies are alive, and it continues until, oh, somebody's dead. Okay, we continue on to the next encounter. And then there's some string stuff that goes, and then there's the next one. So you could have a scripted game where it's encounter, encounter, encounter. and either I'd have to make separate variables for each health. I don't know arrays yet, but at some point I imagine I could have an array, and I'd have to create the array with the size that, I'd have to create the array with a given size. I don't know if I can make it random. Maybe I could. I pass a random number into the array, and then with these namespaces, I have too many specific variables to keep track of, like enemy health, or enemy 1's health, enemy 2's health, enemy 3's health. Right now, I can't create different variables depending on a random number. Like, I can't say, hey, if this, then create this many. If this, create this many. And it'd be totally dependent on the player. So it could be, if the player enters 1, create 1,000 or 1 integer. If the player enters 1,000, create 1,000 integers. With objects, I think I could. So we call whatever creates the object depending on a random number. So in this case, it's not the player, because the player shouldn't determine how many enemies there are. The random number says, hey, okay, it rolled 8. There are 8 enemies. And it creates 8 enemy objects. And then we have a loop that goes through for each of the, or how would it grab all of them? Well, if all the objects, if they're all stored in memory, if I know where they're stored, I can check there, or I can just, I'm trying to think, if I created 8 objects and the objects are enemies, and the objects are instantiations, pieces of a class that exist in memory. It's like I can't say for each integer that exists, do this. Is there a way that I can get how many objects there are? Oh, yeah, I guess so, huh? I could have a global variable called a live enemy count or current enemy count, and then every time I create one, we just update the global variable. So it's, in this case, it's a non-const global variable, but it could be, we could put it in the namespace. So it's not, we could put it in the namespace and make it static, and all the other functions are only in that same file. So we can actually update it, and it's safe, because the only things that can touch it are in that file. So that's as safe as it can be. And it needs to be global because there's no function that it can keep track of. I mean, I guess we could encapsulate it. We could have it within a namespace, or we could have it within a function in a namespace, and it's a static function, so it has internal linkage, so we can only call it from the file that it's defined within, and we call that function, and that function updates it. So we call the function, and it updates how many enemies there are whenever they die, and whenever they, so we could call the function, so like, whenever the enemies have, like, so on the player's turn, when the player attacks, and the enemy if the enemy took damage, and the enemy's health hits 0 or less than 0, then we could call that function, and if the enemy's health hits 0 or less than 0, we call that function with I don't know, do we say a true and a false? Do we say we call it with a Boolean for killed an enemy, didn't kill an enemy? Or either we have a global variable and we have a function that increases it and a function that decreases it. So we can just encapsulate a global variable. Or, but things could still access it. Or we could have a static local variable, and the static local variable is created, and then we initialize it, but then we call a function that continually updates it. Something like that. So we say, every time we create this in an object, we update the enemy count somewhere. So we have some sort of counter, instead of having to like loop through all the things in memory and find the objects, how many enemies exist. Seems like it's easier to just store one fucking integer, and then, and an integer's fine. We're not going to go over like 60,000 or whatever an integer can store. And then, yeah, so the enemies exist, and there's an encounter, and then the enemies all die or the player dies, and then if the player dies, it resets, and, how would we do it if the player dies? I guess we could say, you could have a reset. Yeah, you could have a reset thing where it just, you don't want to go to the very beginning. Do we have a while loop for the entire thing? So if, well, no, because then the entire loop has to execute before we check it again. Oh, we could just continue. And at the very, very beginning of the loop, it starts the game. And if at any point the player dies, then we continue to the next part of the loop. And yeah, so if you die, the loop resets. But if you get to the end of the game, instead of continuing to the next iteration, it's just a return. And then we return from main, done. Cool. Yeah, that would be cool. Instead of having to do, because that way each object we create, or Jesus Christ, each object, I'm thinking in multiple tenses and things right now. Each object that we create for an enemy stores its own, or has its own shit, so its own functions print exactly what it is. Instead of me having to hardcode, hey, enemy 7. But if I wanted to get away from classes for being more, no, I mean, why? Well, how would I do this without classes? If I did it without classes, I'd need a namespace for safety, and I don't know how I would keep track of how many enemies there are. I mean, I guess I could have a loop, and the problem is I don't know how to keep track of how, like, if I name the enemies, if I have the total enemies, and so here it is, like in Pokemon or in Dragon Quest, the enemies are named in letters. So if there are 3 of the same enemy, let's just say enemies are enemies. And if you find 5 enemies, you get enemies A through E. But if you kill enemy C, it doesn't remove E and now you have A through D. It removes C, the enemy you killed. Therefore, you still have A, B, D, and E. That way you know which enemies are. Like you can, maybe after you attack an enemy, it says how hurt it looks. Or when it ends its turn, it sees, oh, enemy A is looking exhausted or whatever. So at the end of the enemy's round, that individual enemy's round, you play like a, or maybe you have an inspect action where you use your turn to look at an enemy, and depending on its health, it'll give you that maybe there's a random number that, well, maybe there's a range. If the health is between this and this, if the health is between this and this, so you have an if-else chain, and then it gives you like a rough estimate of how fucked up the enemy is. But if we didn't have objects, and I had like a loop, let's say we had that global enemy counts every time we roll the number and it creates that many enemies. Okay, cool. How do I keep track of all their individual health? I feel like I have to call that because it's not its own stored thing. It's not like it's a namespace with one variable and I call it one function, and that one function, or the player attacks and it updates that one variable. Well, then I only have one variable. I mean, if I need 8 enemies, now do I have to create 8 enemies? I don't know how that would work. I have to think, well, an object seems like the simplest way because each object has its own instance of all those, I guess, properties, all of those variables that they store. So if I create an enemy, the enemy has its own health, it has its own member functions, it has its own shit. So I can attack that enemy and that enemy's health will update. I don't have to attack an enemy and say which enemy I attacked and go and manually update that enemy's health. I can just attack an enemy and have that enemy update its health. And if that enemy dies, and I can print the other ones that are left. And let's see. Printing how many the enemy IDs would be interesting. How would I store those? I mean, if I had later on an array of characters, I could update the array. So the enemy would have a number and a letter, something like that, and it would find the index and update it to get an ASCII code. So like enemy 0 is A, enemy 1 is B, and 2 is C. So then when we remove 2, we remove C. Therefore we have A, B, and D. But how do I print that and say, hey, all the enemies, or these enemies are alive. You've killed 2 out of 5. You've killed A and B. There's C, D, and E. How do I keep track of which enemies are actually dead without having to get all enemies? Like in Unreal, you could say, okay, get all enemies. And for each enemy, print its name. Okay. C calls its name present. D, present. E, here. It's fucking attendance. In this case, without that, so I'm thinking like there's a round system and it says these enemies alive. Like I could have an array that's a list of those enemies, and then after every round it loops through the enemies and prints its name, but I don't know arrays yet. So I need a way of storing all the enemies. It seems like I still need like a dynamic, like a number, like either an array that can store multiple individual pieces of information, or I need to somehow have separate variables that each have their own thing. I don't know how to do like a for each existing enemy, because then, just like in the very beginning, I have to look through every enemy and see how many exist. And sure, maybe there's a counter, but the counter, if there are 5 enemies and I kill 2, now there are 3. But the 3 counter doesn't tell me which enemies are dead. I mean, I could have I guess I could. I don't know if I can concatenate strings with the plus operator. Because I'm thinking I could have a string and I could update the string. I mean, if I assume a string is a sequence of characters, probably, then the string could be, okay, enemy A is created. Okay, and it puts A in this string, so it assigns A. But then if I spawn the second enemy, enemy 1, because the first one is 0, so enemy 1, that's enemy B, that's its name. And it saves its name B as the second piece of that string. So now it has A and B. And then if I kill it, then it removes that one. I don't know how to store that, though. I mean, I could say, when the enemy dies, it prints its name and says, okay, this enemy's dead. And then each enemy attacks. How did I even make all the enemies attack in one round? So, like, the round happens, and what does it call? And if I'm storing, if I create an object, don't I have to name the enemy object? So I name, yeah, I'm still running into the same thing again, where I have to dynamically create multiple things. Like, I can say, oh, I can just create 5 objects, and they each time they get created, they get a unique ID. Okay, cool. But how do I create multiple and track multiple? I mean, they need to be identified using an identifier, a name. Don't I have to say object, or like the class, and then the name of the object, and then initialize it with something, or don't just create it? But then I still have to reference them. How do I create a bunch of them and have them all attack each round? Because if it was just one function, I just call that one function. If I had a function that makes them all attack, and it loops through them all, what is it looping through? It's still having to do the whole get all enemies thing, and then each one of them will call itself, or will have its attack function called, or its action function called to do something. How do I get all the enemies though? Seems like I can't randomly create a number of objects, because A variable is an object too. It's just a container that stores a value, a piece of memory that stores a value. If I had a random number and I wanted to create that random number amount of integers, and each integer has its own unique value, I don't know how I name them all individually, or set up something that names them all uniquely each time a new one gets created. So the one gets created, and then the second one looks at the global variable and then what? Adds one to it, and then whatever. I mean, I can see it if I'm just calling a function, and then, oh, do I have to call the function that creates it? I call the function, and that function updates it to be, if it's creating something, it has to have the data type, and then it has to have the identifier. But I don't think the identifier can be something previously, because otherwise we get a name conflict. Like if I have integer a, and a is 58, and then later on I create an object, and I create object a. I can't just later on, well, one name conflict right there. But if I create that object later, or if I create object a, integer a, and then later on I create object a plus 1, I don't think I can't have an identifier to be the return value of something. So I don't know how I dynamically make an unknown number of somethings. It's like an unknown number of class objects of enemies. That way I can track how many they exist and the alive ones identifiers. It's like, sure, if I created 4 of them, and then I call enemy A attacks, enemy B attacks, enemy C attacks, enemy D attacks each round, or and for each one it checks to see if it's alive. Cool. I mean, I guess I could create a bunch of enemies and then have a thing that picks how many are actually alive. But then I'm still calling the functions of the dead ones to attack, and they're just not attacking if they're dead. I mean, I guess I could make it so that when they die, the object actually gets destroyed. Then I have calls to invalid shit, maybe. I don't know, let me think.